Hi there. Today's podcast covers some of Disney's most inventive attractions and parks, like Mystic Manor, Tokyo DisneySea, Roger Rabbit and Toontown, and a lot more, with former concept designer and creative senior vice president Joe Lanzisero. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 75 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. One of the key factors in the success of the original Disneyland and beyond was the animation and storytelling backgrounds of some of the legends that worked under Walt Disney, like Mark Davis, Ken Anderson, Claude Coates. There's a very long list of figures that were closely involved in the Disney films and then went on and worked at WED and helped to bring Disneyland to life. And that's also true more recently with the company, where you see some crossover between animators and directors and other types of artists that then go on to work for the parks and to design attractions. A perfect example is my guest today, Joe Lanzisero, who actually was part of the first character animation program at CalArts alongside Brad Bird and John Lasseter and so many others, and then went on to become a feature animator in the 80s. And I mention that because that would be an interesting story on its own, but it's only the starting point for Joe's work at WDI, where he worked as a concept designer and went on to leadership roles. And the list of attractions that he was involved with, either as a designer or as a leader, is stunning. What we cover during this podcast are some of the high points, but there is a lot more to the story. I mean, even within this conversation, we cover multiple attractions in Tokyo. We talk about Hong Kong and the Mystic Point expansion. Disney Cruise Line, he's so involved in the growth and history of Disney Cruise Line, and there's a lot more to it. That's just a small piece of it. And what really stood out to me after talking with Joe is the reminder about the team. It's easy to look at these amazing attractions that Disney puts together and look at someone like a Joe Rohde or even Tony Baxter from the past and think they designed that. This is theirs. Yes, they played an important role, but it took such a large amount of people. And I know this should not be eye-opening to me. This is pretty much an obvious point that all of you know. But really, talking to Joe, he is very good to point out that he was very fortunate and part of a larger group, and that comes through with any of the topics we discussed during this podcast. Before we talk to Joe, I did want to give a quick shout out to our latest Tomorrow Society member, Melinda, who joined last month. Welcome. If you would like to help to support this listener-funded podcast, you can go to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. A small pledge can make a huge difference to helping to keep this show going and giving me a chance to talk to really cool guests like Joe. I have an extra exclusive podcast called the Tomorrow Society Bulletin that I do solely for members. This month's Tomorrow Society Bulletin is all about anniversaries, particularly the Apollo 50th anniversary of the moon landing, but also the upcoming 50th anniversary of Walt Disney World and 40th anniversary of Epcot Center. I'm going to talk about some of my hopes for both of those anniversaries as we look to the future of Walt Disney World. Tomorrow Society Bowl next month will be all about prepping for the D23 Expo and my hopes for what attractions and announcements they have there. And you can learn more again by going to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. Well, this was a blast to record this podcast. Joe had so many good stories and has had a remarkable career. And I hope you enjoy it. I learned a lot about how attractions are put together, especially ones that I want to visit someday, like Mystic Manor. Here is Joe Lanzisero. All right, my guest today is the former creative senior vice president of Walt Disney Imagineering. He began his career as a feature animator and also worked as a concept designer during more than 35 years with Disney. His projects included Mickey's Toontown, Mermaid Lagoon and the Arabian Coast at Tokyo DisneySea, and the Mystic Point expansion at Hong Kong, and has done a lot of work with Disney Cruise Line. He's currently a creative consultant in the theme park industry. It is Joe Lanzisero. Joe, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, I am so happy to be doing this with you today, Dan.
Well, great. I'm just excited because you've done so many interesting things in your career, and there's just a lot of great things to cover. But I want to start kind of near the beginning. So I know you started out as an animator. So what really got you interested in animation and even Disney when you were younger?
You know, I grew up in Burbank, California, and not too far from the Disney studios. And I'm old enough to remember watching the Sunday night show with Uncle Walt and was totally inspired by that. You know, every year my family traveled to Disneyland. In fact, a little bit of interesting history is my father was in the arcade game business, and he actually installed the Davy Crockett arcade in Disneyland back in 1955. And I always told the story about, you know, going to Disneyland and they weren't allowed to bring trucks on site, and he would have to load the equipment onto these donkey carts. And my dad was from New York, and his only frame of reference for theme parks was, or for amusement parks, was Coney Island. And I remember him telling my mom would tell me the story that he would come back and say, you know, this place is going to fail. There's no roller coasters. There's no Ferris wheels. This guy is crazy. But I think it only reinforced, you know, the genius of what Walt was doing back then. And so it's interesting that I had that little bit of history even before I started work, you know, even before I did anything, you know, involved with theme parks.
That's so interesting that your dad had that connection. And it's funny that he had that view, which was very common, I think, at the time. But how did you kind of take that and then, you know, ultimately move to where you were becoming part of the character animation program, taking classes at CalArts?
So, you know, I was always loved to draw as a kid, as far back as I can remember. I loved to draw. And like I said, I grew up watching Uncle Walt on Sunday night and, of course, loved the Disney cartoons. But I was also a big Looney Tunes fan. And I'm also a drummer. I still play drums today. And I was in a band with this gentleman, John Debney, who's now a very famous Hollywood composer. In fact, I think he's doing the Lion King live action film. He works a lot for Disney. And his father was a producer and director at the Disney studios. So I was playing drums in a band with him, but I was always involved and loved to draw, and I was actually making a little animated film on my own at the time when I was still in the band with him, and his name was Lou Debney, and I showed him some of the work that I was doing, and he said, well, you know, they're starting this program at CalArts because a lot of the Disney animators are either retiring, some have passed away, and they finally realized that they need to replenish the ranks there. So he said, if you're interested, I can you know, get your portfolio and put it in front of the right people. And it was kind of a tough decision for me because part of me wanted to be a rock and roll drummer, but this was an amazing opportunity and something that I always wanted to do. So I gave Lou my portfolio. He brought it to CalArts, and I got in. And at the time, I didn't realize what an amazing, amazing opportunity this was and the incredible talents that were there. That first class included people like John Lasseter, of course, who went on to, you know, start Pixar, and Brad Bird was in the class, who, of course, had gone on to do live-action films and Pixar films, including The Incredibles. Good friends with John Musker, who is an absolute legend, went on to do The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, and so many other great films for Disney. So it was an amazing time, but we didn't realize it while we were there. We were just a bunch of kids who loved Disney, loved to draw, loved animation, and loved storytelling. And I feel like we learned as much from each other as we did from the professors. Now, there's no way to discount the incredible program and incredible teachers that they had there. And we were fortunate because most of us, in fact, none of us ever really met Walt, but we were fortunate because all the professors there were the artists that worked directly with Walt. Many of them were the 9 Old Men or key art directors, key designers. So it was an absolutely amazing opportunity. But like I said, at the time, I don't think any of us realized how incredible it was. As I talk to these people today, we all say the same thing. Wow, how fortunate we were to be involved at that time with those people. It was just kind of this magic convergence of a time, a need to replenish these artists, all these great teachers, and all these really talented kids with this drive to carry on this art form.
Yeah, it's so interesting because if you look at that group that you just mentioned and think about it, like you were coming in at the time where before, the Disney Renaissance and all of that, where Disney animation, even after that, but as in the 80s, was, still kind of finding its way. And then all that group that eventually led to Pixar and to so much else, and then to what happened in the theme parks with people like yourself. It's crazy that kind of all fell into place. So, I mean, I know you mentioned that no one realized it, but I mean, what was the atmosphere like? Like, was it super competitive? Was everyone realizing how good you all were? Or again, like you mentioned, it was just so new?
I think it was healthy competition. I just remember everybody really, helping each other. We would look at each other's storyboards, we'd look at each other's films. And, and I think about what John Lasseter did at Pixar in terms of like creating a brain trust and creating an atmosphere where, everybody was looking at each other's work and kind of helping each other, build on what the other person did. And I think part of that too was also what we were taught. Our professors there, talked about how they operated at the studio. And the studio was all about, they called it plussing, that no matter what you did, there was somebody in the next phase of the work or the next part of the process that would take your idea, your drawing, whatever, and make it better. And it was an attitude about, hey, we're all in this together to make a great product. And it wasn't about the ego. In fact, I always remember, that, I am the sole author of this. In fact, I remember the first day when we went to the studio after I got hired, and there was a group of us, many of us from CalArts, and Eric Larson was the mentor. He was one of Walt's 9 Old Men. And one of the first things he told us was, you're going to sit and labor for a year, 2, maybe 3 years on one of these animated films, and when it's put up on the screen, everybody sitting in the audience will think that Walt did everything. That was his way of telling us that, the whole was greater than the sum of the parts, that what was happening was not about us, but about all of us working together to create this great product. I think that's an amazing lesson, and I took that lesson and I carried it with me through everything I think I ever did. Was about empowering and embracing the whole and all these great talents that, together we can create something better and greater than I can do by myself.
Yeah, that's a great lesson to learn, like you mentioned, in so many different fields, but especially with animation and with theme parks, because those projects can get so large. But I know you went on to then work as an animator in the 80s on, several films and such. So what was that experience like when you then moved on and were working on films like The Black Cauldron or The Great Mouse Detective?
It was an interesting time at the studio. We still had some of the old guard was left. They were still trying to find their way because I would say, starting not long after Walt passed away, the films kind of went downhill a bit. And that was part of the reason for the studio doing this program at CalArts in order to infuse some fresh ideas and young talent into the studio. And so I must say, and if you watch The Black Cauldron, it's kind of a mixed bag of things.
It's interesting. I've seen it.
I think all of us who went to CalArts, and others too, not just exclusively CalArts, had a vision for what animation was and should be, and it kind of got a little distorted and over time. And there was a period of some of the films that came out, like I said, post Walt's death and all the way through Black Cauldron, were struggling. I really felt like The Mouse Detective was kind of the turning point. And that was directed by Bernie Mattinson and two young directors, Ron Clements and John Musker. And between the three of them, they were really trying to recapture some of what made the older films great. There was more inventiveness in the storytelling, a little more fun and looseness in the characters and the character design and the animation. To me, that was kind of the turning point, and of course after that, then The Little Mermaid came along and Aladdin and the whole renaissance of animation.
Yeah, I've often heard, even though it's not, I don't know if it's officially included, but The Great Mouse Detective kind of listed as the start, or at least the precursors to the Disney Renaissance, like you mentioned, because then there was Oliver and Company, and then it kind of built up from there. But the Black Cauldron, after that, I mean, it's great that there was so much talent there and faith in everyone that it continued on. But I know then you moved on pretty soon after that, ultimately into Imagineering. So what made you decide to make that move to become a concept designer in the late 80s?
I loved animation, and I'm very thankful for all the great lessons I learned there and all the great people that I got to work with there. But animation, at least in those days, and I think for the most part still, if you're an animator, it's a pretty solitary art. You get your assignment, what scene you're going to animate, and you sit in your room, 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours a day by yourself doing it. And I'm a very social person. I'm a people person. I'm an extrovert, so I get I get energy from people. I had a couple opportunities in animation to work in storyboard and story development. There was a short little film that we did for a couple short films that we were working on for Epcot, and that was actually my entree into Imagineering, because I got to know some of the Imagineers who were in charge of these films. One was for I did a little bit of work on the Seas Pavilion, a little short film that was called Suited for the Seas.
Yeah.
I also did a little bit of work on a film for an attraction at Tokyo Disneyland. But interestingly, that years later, I was instrumental in having it bulldozed for another project that I was in charge of. But that was Meet the World, and there was some animation in that. And then we were also doing some animation for it was a Circle Vision show for PSA at Disneyland, the pre-show for that. And I said, wow, they're doing some really fun, interesting things over there. And I mostly love the collaborative process, that you worked with numerous people, and that the end result, again, like I said earlier, it was about the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. You had a lot of different people, a lot of different energy. Actually, through a friend, he introduced me to Tony Baxter and said, they're starting to really gear up for this big park they're going to build in Paris, and there's a lot of work that's happening down in Florida. And, one of the things that Tony says he thinks is lacking is, the old Mark Davis kind of storytelling stuff that came out of animation. So I met with Tony, and, we hit it off, and he liked the way I approached my thinking and what I was doing. And he said, well, why don't you bring your portfolio over and show it to the people at Imagineering? And literally a week later, I walked across the street, because at that time the animation building, we had moved from the studio to a location on Flower Street across from Imagineering. I literally, packed up my stuff, put it in a box, walked across the street, and started work at Imagineering.
That's interesting how you already got to work on some really cool projects. The Seas film is really neat. And then especially with Paris, and because I know you had some involvement, I believe, with being on the team for Phantom Manor. So how did that work out? What did you do on that one?
Those were some of my early assignments when I first arrived over at Imagineering, because again, it was Tony who brought me over. He just had me doing gags for, I wasn't involved in the big concept of Phantom Manor, but he was kind of trying to use me the same way Walt used Mark Davis. And in no way am I comparing myself to Mark Davis, because he is in my opinion, a god. I put him on, on a pedestal, but unfortunately I got to know Mark and, and I fortunately got to learn a lot from him. But I mean, they were looking for that kind of more animation-like, gag thinking. So I was able to apply that to some of the things that they were doing on Phantom Manor. At the same time, Typhoon Lagoon had just started in design, and it was the same thing. They asked me to just add some gags and some fun ideas to that park. And I got to say, Marty Sklar was my champion almost from day one. I think Marty really understood what I brought to Imagineering and always supported me. One of the early things we did, this was back in the Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg days when they were very much in, having the Hollywood stars involved, and they wanted to do a redo of the Tiki Room and wanted to have personality birds, based on some of the big stars that they were currently using in the movies, like Bette Midler and Danny DeVito. So I did this whole concept for a redo of the Tiki Room, and it did caricatures of the birds were caricatures of those famous stars. And Marty loved it, and I remember him even telling me the story where he personally brought it to Michael Eisner to show him, the work on it. So that was a very interesting time and an exciting time, because that was the kickoff of the Disney decade. When they were doing Disneyland Paris, they were just finishing up on the studio, just starting on Animal Kingdom. I mean, there was so much stuff going on at that time. It was an amazing time to be at Imagineering.
I can imagine, because like you mentioned, there were still these legendary people like Marty Sklar and even, a rising Tony Baxter and such, like a really mix of kind of like yourself, kind of newer blood, and then mixed with the old guard. And plus with Michael Eisner, who was just expanding everything so much. Everything I hear about that time, I went to the parks a lot at that time. Growing up, I was like a teenager at that time. And it was just every time you went, there was so much to see. And so hearing what you were able to do is great, because you came in at such a good time, especially given the movie connection. I feel like a lot of the gags and such probably comes from your background as an animator, like Mark Davis's background from the movies. So I know the next thing you kind of did is, you led the Toontown project, which to me, I think of something where having that background with gags, Toontown seems like a perfect place for you. So how did that come together and getting that started?
Again, I think I have to thank Marty. He saw, that I had that sensibility. They were kicking around ideas. The Toontown grew out of the need to create a place where people were guaranteed to meet Mickey Mouse. And they had been working on a couple different ideas. They had done like a Mickey meet and greet, and they had done something down in Florida where you could meet Mickey. But they knew they wanted something more immersive. And then we started working on this idea of just creating this little neighborhood for Mickey. But then simultaneously, the studio was working on Roger Rabbit, and Michael Eisner got all excited about the idea, because the story in Roger Rabbit, of course, is there's the Toontown where all the cartoon characters live. So we showed him what we were doing with Mickey's. At the time, it was called Mickey Land, and he goes, "Well, why don't we expand it? Call it Toontown, and you guys can have your little Mickey Land part, and we can add the whole Roger Rabbit piece to it." And I got to tell you, again, just like when I was at CalArts at the time, I didn't realize what an amazing opportunity it was. I just dived into it, head first. They said, we're going to give you this land, and you're going to lead the team to design it. And I guess looking back, if I was a little smarter and less naive, I would have been freaked out, but I was just super excited. And they also partnered me with a great partner, David Burkhart, who was older than myself, had worked on projects at Walt Disney World, and he just knew the nuts and bolts of things, and just a smart guy and very level-headed. I look back, I was fortunate on many projects to be paired with people that I think complemented me and the kinds of things that I brought, and then together, like I keep saying, it's a team effort there. You're never in it by yourself, and if you're put together with the right people, you can do incredible things. So they brought Dave in, and at the time, we were doing Toontown at the same time Euro Disney was just finishing up. And the other thing we benefited from were all these great field talents, people that had just come off of Euro Disney, painters, rock sculptors, prop makers. So we really, really were able to get just, some of the top people, and they just come off this big project. We had this little project in Disneyland, but everybody jumped into it and embraced it like it was as big and as great as Disneyland Paris. So again, it's all about timing, and I've had very good timing in my career.
So Roger Rabbit's cartoon spin, it's a really intriguing ride to me because it reminds me a bit of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, but taken to this next level. It's like, it's Roger Rabbit, so it's a bit crazier and off the cuff. But what was it like to create or work on that attraction?
Well, you nailed it, and I would be the first to admit we were highly inspired by Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. The thing about Mr. Toad's Wild Ride is most people don't know that story or haven't seen that film, but it just stands on its own rather as a really fun experience. And that for me was a really big lesson about adapting a known product at the time. You have to think about it in a way that, okay, what happens, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when the film is no longer popular and people don't know who those characters are. We looked at what Mr. Toad had just in terms of crazy things. You're going down that railroad track and there's a train coming at you and you go to hell and there's little devils around you. It's like, you don't have to know the film to enjoy it. So that was a big inspiration for us. Now, we knew we had to hit on some of the story points from the film, the whole thing with Dip and some of the characters, of course. We wanted to see Jessica Rabbit. But in the end, it was just about creating these really fun and crazy moments that had to stand up on their own and withstand the test of time. And that was a big lesson for me that I actually carried through most of the projects I did that had any connection with IP. I always wanted to make sure that the core experience that guests were having, whether it was on the Monsters, Inc. ride that we did later on, or any of the things that we did with Marvel later on, and some of the things I did on a cruise ship, all that included IP and characters. My first concern was always to make it the core experience, make it fun, make it, have clear communication. Guests know what you're trying to tell them in terms of how they're going to be involved in this experience. Because in the end, you can't depend on the IP, because the IP is going to fade, and people just have to walk away from the experience saying, hey, that was fun.
I think that's a great point, because right now, as you know, Star Wars Galaxy's Edge just opened, and there's really a focus on IP and such. And it's like you mentioned, that's okay, but it can't just be about that. It can't be a book report. It has to be something unique. And yeah, Roger Rabbit's a perfect example. And some recent attractions are a great example, but it's not a guarantee that's always going to happen.
Right. And I think one of the things that makes Roger Rabbit still fun today is just that you get to spin the car. And I remember that was something that, was the first time, there was an interactive ride system like that. Later on we did Indiana Jones and other things. But it was just because we wanted something that would first differentiate it from the other dark rides, because at the time there was multiple dark rides at Disneyland. And we said, well, how are we going to set ourselves apart? And again, it just made it something unique. And even today, just the fun of sitting in the vehicle and spinning it, even if you don't know who those characters are and you don't know what Dip is, you're still going to walk out of that ride having had a good time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just the little bit of interactivity and just the fun of spinning. But I have to mention, I had a listener send me a photo of what I believe is a cameo of yourself in the ride. They said I had to ask you about this. So explain that. How did that come to being?
Okay, so believe it or not, back in the studio days, there was a gentleman who was actually a professional clown from Ringling Brothers. He put together a little clown troupe, and that we would do parades and charity events. And I was actually a clown for a while, as was one of the designers on the Roger Rabbit cartoon spin, an incredibly talented gentleman by the name of Marcello Vignali. Marcello went on to be an art director at Sony for years. And I think he's back at Disney now, but he did a lot of the design work with me on the interior of the show. And so there's a scene where there's two big crazy clowns, and one of them is a caricature of Marcello, and the other is a caricature of me.
I love it. I like the personal touch, because I'm looking at the picture and I can see the resemblance a bit, but it's not so obvious where if I hadn't been pointed out, I wouldn't see it.
No, we didn't want to make it so obvious.
Yeah, no, it's really fun though, for sure. Well, I wanted to mention some of the other things you worked on. One of the big ones, obviously, which is kind of for me the top of my bucket list of places to go, which is Tokyo DisneySea. And I know you were closely involved with the creative development of several lands for that, including the Arabian Coast section, which has the Sinbad attraction, which is one of those attractions that I would love to see someday. So can you talk a bit about working on just Tokyo DisneySea, but especially that area?
Yeah, I got to say, everything I ever got to do in Tokyo, I'm so very, very proud of. We had a great partner, and they have a great partner still, in the Oriental Land Company, who I believe really pushed us to do the very best that Disney could do. And in fact, there was even periods in the history of Imagineering where, at the same time Tokyo DisneySea was being designed, developed, and built, they were doing Disney's California Adventure. And if you can compare the two, it's the finished products were on opposite ends of the spectrum. And it's not because there weren't a lot of great, talented people. It was because they weren't being given the right opportunities in terms of the resources, in terms of money, and the desire to do things at a Disney scale and at a Disney quality. And that's what Oriental Land Company wanted. So I was very fortunate working with the team under the direction at the time of Steve Kirk, and he had his brother Tim Kirk, very, very talented guys, had a great vision for the park. They wanted a lot of story, a lot of detail. So I had just come off of Toontown. So, of course, the kind of the cartoon equivalent to Toontown in Tokyo DisneySea was Mermaid Lagoon. So I led the initial design on Mermaid Lagoon. What ended up in the field was pretty close to my original concept. There were some changes along the way, but I feel very proud of what ended up in the field, because for the most part, it reflected the work that I had done on and kind of laying it all out and coming up with the big ideas for it. And then Arabian Coast, I did again based on, although it wasn't supposed to be Aladdin land. Aladdin, the cartoon feature had come out, was very popular. They wanted it more real world, but I took a lot of cues from Aladdin. Of course, we had the genie, the magic lantern show with the genie, and the carousel. And it was actually my idea to do the double-decker carousel. I wanted some big, large, iconic element in the land. And I worked a little bit on the first pass of the Sinbad ride, but I got to say that was actually another team that kind of took it and developed it into what ended up in the park. But again, ironically, years later, when I went back and I was in charge of Tokyo DisneySea, I actually got a chance to go back in and rework it a bit. And that was great because I got to work with Alan Menken, who did the music for Little Mermaid, and we came up with a musical score for it and got to redo some of the scenes. And that was pretty fun. But yeah, Tokyo DisneySea probably, and anyone who's been there will agree with me, probably the most beautiful of all the Disney parks. There's so much detail, there's so much thought, there's so much great story there. And that's in no way to discount any of the other great parks and great lands that are out there. But I think collectively, in terms of an overall consistency in terms of the level of greatness, nothing else compares with Tokyo DisneySea.
Oh, I agree. And I haven't been there, but it's one of those parks where even when you see pictures of it, it's almost hard to wrap your brain around everything, because it looks, I mean, even you mentioned Mermaid Lagoon, which has some kiddie rides and such, but it looks incredible. It doesn't look like, I hate to say it, like a Bug's Land or something. Just as a counterpoint, nothing against that land, but it's just everything seems to be done on this level of scale that is stunning. I mean, it's designed so beautifully. So most people I talk with, either who've been there or who want to go there, it's that same way. But I want to hit on a few. I know later on when you were a vice president overseeing things, several really innovative attractions came in. Pooh's Honey Hunt and the Monsters Ride and Go Seek, which are both, unique in their own way to that park. So how did it feel to be involved with so many innovative attractions when that was kind of under your purview?
Again, looking back, I feel privileged because a lot of it, like we said earlier, is about timing. It was about being there at the right time. As I've already said, we had our partner, an Orient Land Company, that wanted to do new and unique things. And I got to say, Tokyo DisneySea kind of raised the bar. I also got to say I was fortunate. I was the concept designer and the overall lead designer for the Splash Mountain in Tokyo Disneyland. And in some ways, that was probably the first really big themed land with a level of detail that was kind of at the same level of what they ultimately did in Tokyo DisneySea's. And the Orient Land Company at first was, they were a little taken back by, the costs and what it took to do something like that. But they quickly realized, especially the Japanese audience who loves to get into the details of these things and really dives deep into the stories and all the minutiae in the design. And they realized that they had an audience that really, really appreciated that. And that's why Tokyo DisneySea, I think, took what we had started doing with Splash Mountain and took it to the next level. And I was fortunate once I became the creative lead vice president in charge of the resort there and the projects that were given to me afterward. The bar had been set, and not just by me, but by others, and Orient Land Company wanted to maintain that level of detail, of storytelling, and of innovation too. They wanted to have bragging rights to say, hey, we've got the best Tower of Terror. We got the best Midway Mania. And what a great thing. Again, looking back at the time, it was an amazing opportunity that I was just happened to be there when I had this client or a land company who was challenging us and pushing us to do the best version of whatever we could do in the parks.
Yeah, I mean, that comes through with how the parks are, both the parks, and I know they're currently even doing more expansions there or talking about it, and I expect it to be at the same level because, like you said, when you have someone like the Orient Land Company working with you, it gives more support to do those types of things. So, I think both parks and their popularity are a testament to it. They're beloved.
Absolutely.
Over there. So speaking of bragging rights, I know that the big project that I have to talk to you about is the Mystic Point and Mystic Manor in Hong Kong, because I know that park, when that expansion came in, it really seemed to me like Imagineering and such really went all out to create one of the greatest attractions that we've ever seen with Mystic Manor. So can you tell me about how that kind of came to fruition, that project there?
Well, first, thank you for your kind words. And I gotta say, may have been the high point of my career. And at the time, I didn't realize it, but in a way, it was my swan song. First off, it was because of a partner. In this case, it was the Hong Kong government who were part owners of the park, and they actually had a majority share of the park. So they had a pretty big voice in terms of telling us what they wanted to see in the park without being dictatorial about creative in any way. But they knew that the park that was delivered to them was a little under par in terms of the scale of it and in terms of the innovation. So when I got the assignment to come in to do this expansion, they were pretty clear in that, they wanted unique content, which was unbelievable because it came at a time when Disney was getting more and more involved with Pixar, with Marvel, and then ultimately, of course, with Lucasfilms in terms of, using existing IP as the story base for attractions. So imagine how privileged I was or how privileged I felt when they said, hey, we want you to develop completely original content. And initially, when we did the expansion, we had 3 lands, and all 3 lands were going to be unique with their own stories. It was just because of some timing and some issues with the government, because they were concerned because there's a second park in Hong Kong called Ocean Park, and they were doing an expansion at the same time, and one of their ideas was similar to one of the things that we were proposing. So we ended up doing Toy Story Land, which in the end I felt like was the right thing to do, because when you look at the 3 lands that we delivered, Toy Story Land, Grizzly Gulch, and Mystic Point, there's a great contrast between the 3 in terms of the look and the feel and the storytelling. So, of course, the first thing we delivered was the Toy Story Land, which was basically a variation on what had been done in Paris. And, of course, they've since gone on to do versions in Orlando and now in Shanghai. And then Grizzly Gulch, they wanted a version of a frontier land, but again with a different spin on it. So we came up with the whole Grizzly Gulch and the bears hiding in the mountain and that fun coaster. But without a doubt, the high point for me was coming up with Mystic Point. Mystic Point is actually, and the story there is a little bit of a continuation of the story that we created for Tower of Terror in Tokyo. And we came up with this backstory about the Society of Explorers and Adventurers, SEA. And Harrison Hightower, who was the character that we created for the Tower of Terror in Tokyo, was kind of the bad version of Lord Henry Mystic. Harrison Hightower went around the world stealing artifacts, and then it kind of turned on him in a bad way. But with the story that we created for Mystic Point, we wanted it to be a little more lighthearted, a little more fun, but still have that sense of, a little bit of mystery and adventure to it. Initially, they wanted us just to do a version of the Haunted Mansion. After we did some research, we found that, the Chinese have a very different relationship with the afterlife, and this whole idea of singing happy ghosts that we have in our Western versions of the Haunted Mansion wouldn't have played well there. That was kind of a turning point for us in how we thought about, how we wanted to create this attraction. But we wanted to keep the core of what the Haunted Mansion was all about, and it's really a great illusion show. Yale Gracie and the Imagineers who created that ride, they were great illusionists. The Pepper's Ghost effects that they used in the ballroom, and all the cool projection work that they did in the seance room and such. I mean, it was so innovative at the time, and we were so inspired by that. We said, hey, we want to create an experience that really has unique special effects that we haven't seen before, but now find the right story that we can do that can tie it all together. And then we came up with the story of Lord Henry Mystic. He's an adventurer and explorer like the other characters, and he meets this monkey character. And what was fun for us was thinking that the way we approached it, we kind of thought about it like we were creating a movie. We came up with the characters, we came up with the situations, we tried to create motivation for the characters, who they were. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the characters and about the monkey. So because of that, I think it plays like a ride based on an IP, because we really wanted to make sure that the guests understood the relationships, like, for example, of the Lord Henry Mystic and the little monkey. And as you go through the queue line in the pre-show, we set up, how they met, what their relationship was like. We set up the whole idea of this magic music dust that lives in this artifact that they find. So hopefully by the time they get to the actual pre-show where they go in and they meet the monkey for the first time, and there's a little film that talks about all those things I just mentioned, people really have an understanding of, oh, okay, there's this story, there's these characters, and then when you get in that ride vehicle, it works, hopefully it works the same way like if you've seen a movie, because we kind of set up the characters, we set up the place, and you get in the ride, and then the adventure starts. And that was a unique opportunity to be able to take, for me, all those skills that I had learned through the years, back in animation, through all the attractions that I did, in all the various parks. And for me, it was kind of a culmination of all that.
Yeah, and I think that's what really stands out from that. And the Tower of Terror is in both cases, because like you mentioned, we didn't have the connection as much to the Haunted Mansion. And then with Tower of Terror not having the Twilight Zone, because it's not as big a connection, in both cases, you were kind of able to build these deep stories that were possible. And another thing with Mystic Manor is you have the score from Danny Elfman, who obviously has done some movies. So what was that like to work with him?
Oh, it was absolutely amazing. I mean, and that just dropped in our laps. We were, it was at D23, and I can't remember what year it was a couple of years before we actually started, to do construction on the project, and we were showing off the expansion for Hong Kong. This gentleman, Richard Kraft, who is Danny Elfman's agent, but more than that, is a huge Disney fan, came to D23, saw what we were doing with Mystic Manor. At that time, Danny Elfman was wanting to stretch out beyond the movies that he was doing and was looking for other opportunities. And Richard Kraft went to him and told him about this, modern version of the Haunted Mansion. And we got the call from Danny Elfman. I remember the day I was sitting at my desk and said, yeah, this is Richard Kraft. I represent Danny Elfman, and he's interested in doing the music for your ride. Can you imagine getting that call? My jaw drops at the floor. And I got to tell you, his sensibility was perfect for the attraction, because like all the great work he's done with Tim Burton on all those films and all the stuff that Danny does, it's sinister but fun, and it's a little spooky but fun. He always has this kind of undercurrent of fun in what he does, and it absolutely was the perfect marriage for what we were trying to do in terms of the overall tone and feel that we were going after on Mystic Manor.
Yeah, I mean, the score is so important. And like you mentioned, the sense of fun, it's not really super menacing, because some of the effects might seem that way. You always have that part of it, and it really makes it work. It's an impressive achievement. I can understand how good it had to feel to work on something like that. So I wanted to ask you one more thing, which I know you've done so much on Disney Cruise Line, more than we could possibly cover with a short question here. But I did want to make sure that I asked you, because I know you've done a lot of work, designing certain sections early on and then overseeing it. And I'm just curious to kind of get your perspective on, because it's an entirely different type of business for Disney, but I know it has connections to working, doing things for theme parks. So kind of from your experiences, what was the big difference when you're doing things for a cruise line versus kind of what you had been doing for some of the attractions we've talked about?
Well, I think it was different, but the same. And I'll explain that. The same in that it still had to be an emotional experience. I mean, what makes Disney rides and attractions and shows great is that they're either based on IP or based on stories that in some way have an emotional connection to the guests. You know those characters, you've heard that song, it makes you feel a certain way. And that's what brings people back to the Disney parks, that it connects with them some way emotionally. So that's the thing that's the same on what we were trying to do on the cruise ship. The thing that was different was, I call it the storytelling form. In the parks, you have rides that run anywhere from 3 to 12 minutes long. You have shows that are 20 minutes long. So it's kind of a short form of storytelling. What I quickly realized on the cruise ships that we had this luxury of time to tell the stories and to modulate the stories. Because on a cruise ship, we had guests for 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, 12 days. You didn't have to rush to get to an end of an experience, that we could plan the experience over multiple days, like we did with the detective agency game that we created for the for the cruise. Some of the experiences on the upper deck in terms of the water play, and infusing story into those, or the miniature golf course that we did, the shows on the ship. So it's just a different way to thinking about how we applied Disney storytelling, Disney IP, across a longer period of time, how it would be experienced over that longer period of time. And also knowing, too, that we wanted to modulate the amount of Disney, because we had some guests that may not want to have, as much of the infusion of Disney characters and storytelling as you would get in a theme park, but we still wanted to make sure it was there. So we were very careful about how we apportioned it across the ship. In some cases it was, it was right out in front of you, in terms of a visual thing. In other cases it was more thoughtfully subliminal or on a less blatant level. Like I think about what we did with the Remy restaurant on the Disney Dream and Fantasy, where it's based on the characters from Ratatouille. But when you walk in, the first take is, wow, this is a very elegant looking restaurant. It looks like something I might see in Paris somewhere. But so that's your first take. But then when you start looking closer, you see, there's the Remy character that's been designed into the back of the seats, and there's a little fixture that has the characters on it. And then we created the actual dining room from Gaston's in the movie. So it was a different way of thinking about how you applied the Disney storytelling, but in the end we still had to have the same end result. That was that you had this emotional experience because the characters, the stories, and we're delivering them to you in a way that is touching.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to end because, like you mentioned, that kind of approach is what you're going to take on any project, and especially give a lot of the ones we've talked about. Joe, thank you so much for doing this. You've had an amazing career. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about some of it.
Dan, it was an absolute privilege to be able to talk to you today and to relive some of these great opportunities that I was given over the years. And I really feel fortunate, that I'm gone from Disney. The things that I was able to be involved with live on.
I want to give a big thanks to Joe Lanzisero for taking the time to talk with me on this podcast. If you enjoyed this show, you should listen to episodes with Dan Cockrell and Peggy Ferris. You can find both of those at tomorrowsociety.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can always email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. And don't forget, if you'd like to learn more about becoming a member of the Tomorrow Society, you can go to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. Another way to support the podcast is to leave ratings and reviews at Apple Podcasts or through your preferred podcast provider. It makes a huge difference in helping to spread the word about this show. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I will be talking with sound expert Glenn Barker, who has worked for Disney for more than 40 years, putting together sound for so many classic attractions. It's a fascinating conversation. Thanks once again for listening and for all the support, and I will talk to you again very soon.